Hi, Earth Nation. This is Amanda with the Activated Earth, and I'm here with Dana O'Driscoll, and we're going to have a great conversation. I just know it. I'm going to read her bio to you so you know what she's all about. So, Dana has been an animist druid for over 18 years and currently serves as a Grand Archdruid in the Ancient Order of Druids in America. She is a Druid grade member of the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids and is the OBOD's 2018 Mount Haemus Scholar. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Yeah.
She is the author of Sacred Actions, Living the Wheel of the Year Through Earth-Centered Spiritual Practices, the Sacred Actions Journal, and the forthcoming Healing Hands, Physical and Metaphysical Healing of the Earth, books through Red Feather. She is also the author illustrator of the Tarot of Trees, which I've seen pictures of on your Instagram, and it's beautiful. Plant Spirit Oracle and Tree Lore Oracle and Magical Compendium of Eastern North American Trees. Dana is a certified permaculture designer and permaculture teacher who works to live regeneratively and heal the land. Dana lives at a 5-acre homestead in rural Western Pennsylvania with her partner and a host of feathered and furred friends. So, and she is Druid's Garden on Instagram and writes as Druid's Garden. But we're gonna cover ways to contact you towards the end, so that'll get to repeat. The one thing that jumped out to me in here that I wanted to start with was healing the land in the physical and the metaphysical. Could you tell us what both of those mean and how do you marry the two?
Yeah. Okay, that's a big question, and it's
I
a good
know.
question. It's a
Feel
really
free to
good
talk as
question.
long as you want.
Well, it's a good question to start because, like, as I'm sitting here in my office, not outside, we've got all this smoke from wildfires, and we've got all of these climate things that are happening all summer. And I think that people are really starting to recognize, like, climate change and a lot of the challenges we're facing with the age of the Anthropocene, the human-driven changes to the world, the sixth mass extinction. These are not future problems, these are current problems. So when I think about what does it mean to practice earth-centered spirituality today, that means as much on the like it's not just so to me, it's not just enough to go into the woods and enjoy myself, because there are so many challenges that we face. And so to me, a core part of earth spirituality is thinking about how do we engage in healing, how do we engage in good for on behalf of the land, on behalf of all life that's not human. And so when we think about, of course, as I'm both a permaculture practitioner and a druid, I do think about those things on both the physical and metaphysical world. So I'll sort of just break those down, right?
Yeah.
So in terms of physical land healing and regeneration, we have these narratives in our culture that basically tells us that that humans are bad, that humans damage nature, that all we can do is really do less bad. And what things like permaculture design does is say, actually, no, we can be forces of good, of healing on the planet. And there's actually a lot of things that we could do physically to regenerate and heal the land. So rather than saying, okay, how can I be less bad, or how can I buy better products? Like, instead it's like, okay, so I bought a piece of property, like my partner and I bought a piece of property that had a lot of the forest cut down. So how do we become a force of good? Now, eventually that forest can heal itself, right? But if we intervene, we can actually do that much faster, planting trees, planting woodland medicinal species. So a lot of physical land regeneration is sort of saying, well, where do I live? And how can I help the land? And that really depends on, do you own property? Do you not own property? Are you in an urban environment? Are you in a suburban environment? And really thinking about how you can do the most good. So for example, somebody in a suburban environment that has, say a 1/4 acre lawn, well, a lawn is a really damaged place. It doesn't really provide food or forage for anyone. It consumes a lot of resources. It contributes to climate change. So that's a place that nature had once existed, and now it's just grass. So a really simple thing is like, well, how do we create an ecosystem there? Maybe that's a butterfly garden, maybe that's an orchard, and just sort of really taking that idea of healing and saying, well, where can I do the most good? Something that I talk about really a lot in my upcoming book is really thinking about this concept of refugium. So this is another physical practice where we have, to sort of go back to this, during the Ice Age, there were all of these just sort of destructive forces on the world, all this ice, all these glaciers, and a lot of ecosystems that weren't surviving. But there were these small pockets of life that did survive. And that's what the scientists called refugia or refugium, right? And these are sort of intense pockets of life. Like, this is how humanity survived. Humanity survived in the edges of the Mediterranean on cliffs, right? And we know here in North America, there were places where life survived, even though there were all these glaciers, and then when the glaciers receded, all of this life could spring forth. So one of the practices that I'm really advocating for in terms of physical land healing is to create refugia. So find out, how do you create an intense pocket of life that is a place where you can have things growing? So like, we live on 5 acres and it's literally surrounded by conventional farm fields. So our 5 acres is extraordinarily abundant and extraordinarily rich, has lots of lightning bugs and lots of birds and lots of wildlife. And we've really spent a great deal of time saying, well, what are the plants that should have been growing here and how can we heal? And then hopefully at some point that life can spread out again. And so it's essentially creating this pocket of life that can survive sort of these conditions on the broader landscape that are maybe not really hospitable to a lot of that life. So that's sort of, there's a lot more we can go into, but those are some things that we can think about in terms of physical land healing, right? So how are we saying we can be tenders of the land, we can heal? And to me, this is something obviously I want to do because of the crisis we face, but it's also something that for me is very much a spiritual practice. It's a way for me to give back and say, I see the world as a sacred place, and I see my role as a human, as a caretaker for the land, as somebody who is here to help protect and guide, not somebody to take and pillage, right? So if we think about that metaphysically, here in Western Pennsylvania, I live in an area that has a lot of human extractive activities. So we have acid mine drainage, that's 3,000 miles of streams that are damaged from old coal mines that basically pollute all the time. We have mountaintop removal. We have gas and natural gas fracking. We have coal-fired power plants. We have just various kinds of factory activities, large-scale logging. So we sort of have like the gamut of many of the problems that we talk about. And there's a lot of places where I can't go in and do physical healing. There's a mountaintop removal site that's about 15 minutes south of where I'm sitting right now. And that site has been being damaged since before I moved to this area, and who knows how long it's going to be there. So in that case, what can I do? Well, that's where ritual, ceremony, physical healing comes in. Over the years, I do a lot of this as my primary spiritual practice. So I've sort of developed a few different ways of thinking about that. Like, what would that site, what kind of healing could I do for that site? Well, that's sort of like a palliative care situation. Like, as opposed to a site that maybe was damaged, but now has an opportunity to heal. So I can talk a lot more about those things, but for me, when there's a lot of work we can't do physically because we don't have access to, or it's too large. And so that's where we can turn to rituals, to ceremonies, to prayers, to intentions. And I really feel like it's the synthesis of both of those things. And in some ways, these problems that we face are so huge that it's almost like we have to turn to ceremony. We have to turn to prayer, because I, as a human being, on this very damaged landscape where I live, I get really overwhelmed if I think about trying to do everything, right? But I can do small things. I can do what's in my capacity, and then I can do large healing rituals. And so doing all of those things to help the land and the spirits of the land and the spirits of nature say, hey, I'm here. I'm not abandoning you. And maybe I'm a different kind of human than you've been used to, but hopefully I'm a human that will help us. And hopefully there'll be more humans like me, coming through in the future.
Yeah. I have a question about something that you said a few minutes ago, where one site has an opportunity to heal and another one might need palliative care. Do you make choices about where to put more energy because of that? And okay, how do you feel that works effectively?
Yeah. So I think that one of the things that we have to be careful of, especially with me being a white person living in lands that are colonized,
Mhm.
is that I have to be careful that I'm not imposing my thoughts and my will upon the land. There's been too much of that. There's been a lot of my ancestors that have done that and have done a lot of damage. So to me, the most important part of land healing, either physical or metaphysical, is going into a place and doing deep listening. And from there, co-constructing sort of intentionality. So I go to an active mountaintop removal site. I don't, and I'm like, what do you need? Maybe I'm just bearing witness. Maybe I'm just there apologizing. That would not be a site that I would raise a bunch of energy and inject. Why? Because that's active damage. It's almost like somebody is sleeping and they're sick. What are you going to do? You're going to try to make them comfortable, right? Versus somebody who maybe, and so that would be as opposed to say, we have a forest fire. This is now a place on the land that actually I could come in and say, hey, I could do a wonderful healing ceremony for you. I could bring in a lot of positive energy to help you heal and regenerate. So to me, there's a huge difference between the active mountaintop removal that's actively being damaged and maybe a site that could actively be healed, right?
Yeah.
In either case, so I have that sort of framework in my mind going in, recognizing that different circumstances would call for different kinds of healing and ceremonial work, but I would never do any of it without explicit permission from the spirits of the land. And I would never assume that I know best. And sometimes, you like, there was a site near where I live that was a forest that was recently cut down to turn into a field. And it's a place there's a lot of anger there. And I've been past that site and I've stopped a few times. And every time I stop, the land is like, leave. We don't want you here. And so the last thing I'm going to do is be another human imposing my will upon that land. If that land is like, no, I'm angry, I don't want any humans here, then I'll just come back maybe 6 months or a year and say, hey, I'm still here. I'm here. I'm sorry. And so I really think that a lot of this is, it's not just about me saying, well, how do I approach different situations for healing, which I think is really an important question, right? Sort of
Mhm.
how these different contexts matter, but also it's like, how am I learning how to inhabit this land in a way that is co-constructive and that is not me, and like not me being another human saying I know best. And to me that's just as important. So a lot of land healing, I mean, certainly we can talk about specific ceremonial approaches that, that I use and others use in the Druid community, but a lot of it is also just like listening, respect, apologizing on behalf of humanity, witnessing trees getting cut down in my town. I'm going to witness that and I'm going to be there and I'm going to hold space. And maybe that's all I do. So I really believe really firmly that that's part of what we as human beings, particularly living in like Western civilization here in the United States, a lot of our problems stem from like being narcissistic and assuming we know best and
Right.
assuming that we are the be all end all and we're the ones that should be making the decisions. And the more that we step back from that and sort of
Mhm.
open ourselves up to the living earth, the spirits of the land, and maybe their wisdom and teachings, the more that I think we can learn and grow and then help each other.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I love it that you are asking the land what it wants. Because as somebody who wants to live off the land, I want to enhance what's there, and I don't want to change it into something that it can never be. You
Yeah.
know, different types of soil, different types of slopes. I'm wondering if you did the same thing when you went to create your farm. I mean, what steps did you take for that kind of process?
Yeah. So going back to sort of the physical practice of permaculture, one of the very first things that permaculture suggests is observing and interacting. And typically that's like a year and a day, which is also very magical, right?
Mhm.
Um, and again, like understanding what's there, understanding who's living there, what are the plants growing, what are the possibilities, and taking the time to really spend time with the land. And again, for me, it's that's that piece of being aware and co-creating spaces, right? So I say to the land, hey, I'd really love to put a garden in. These are the 3 areas that have full sun. Where might it be the best? And what kinds of things would that garden help with, say the insect life here? So yeah, my partner and I, he's also a Druid. We do a lot of that. We spend a lot of time. We sort of believe in this idea of like, spiraling and deepening over time, and spending a lot of time on the land and doing a lot of listening, and over time sort of putting some agreements in place. There are parts of our farm and our homestead that are completely wild that we don't go into and we don't touch, and those are spaces that have been designated as such by this co-creation, right? There are places that we intensively manage, and it's okay for us to go ahead and pull all the weeds in that space because that's a space for us to grow vegetables, for example. And really thinking about how do all of us, all of the beings on this land, whether they're our goose flock or whether they're the lightning bugs or the trees, like how are we all living here together in harmony, honoring and respecting and reciprocating? And so then if I think about how am I getting a yield from that land to feed myself and my family, it's not just that I am extracting, right? It's that this is a relationship that we're building, and thinking about things like perennial crops over annual crops, which are much like eating hazelnuts, as like these sort of thinking about that, and what did my original ecosystem look like, and how do we bring that ecosystem back? So it's a lot of that kind of stuff. And yeah, for us, we're like 5 or 6 years in now, so it's really becoming a more mature space. And we're still in the process of sort of, converting a lot of the lawn. The lawn that's left is working for our flocks, and really thinking carefully about how do we sink carbon? How do we become, not even carbon neutral, but actually like sinking more carbon than we're using, and, all of those things. But I do think that these things take time. And again, I really value the idea of not just coming in and imposing my will and imposing my vision, which I think is where I deviate from traditional permaculture, which is all about observe, interact, create a plan, but it's all very like human, and it's creating a plan in harmony with nature. But I'm saying, no, actually, we just really need to talk to the land, talk to the, in Druidry, we talk about the genus loci, like the spirit of place, or, the land spirits. And obviously I'm an animist, so I'm talking like an animist right now. But really thinking about like those relationships. And what I have found is if I create space to do that and I make that really intentional, then the land almost knows better than I do. Like the ideas that I have, the land has better ideas, and I don't know how to describe it, but this co-construction is to me really important, and it is an evolutionary process.
Yeah. And when you mention that aspect of permaculture, I even asked about that because I've taken permaculture design as well. And I think that we do get to explain for people who don't know what permaculture is, what that means. But a point that I wanted to bring up that I'd love for you to speak on is I was told by one of my teachers that they purposely left this spiritual connection out of permaculture so as not to narrow their niche of people that would want to learn it. They wanted it to be important that people learn how to work with the land in a cooperative way. But I feel like that's a really missing piece. And that's what I'm hearing you start to allude to right now. Do you think you could talk about how that, I want more depth about how that makes you different? And I don't necessarily want to use the word better, but I think it's whole. It's whole when it's like that.
Yeah, I've been doing a lot of writing on the connection of nature, spirituality, and permaculture, and thinking about it and practicing it on my blog. And really, we're talking 12, 15 years thinking about these things. So one of the ways that I personally thought that permaculture needed to expand is rather than having the 3 ethics. So, earth care, people care, fair share, I've added a 4th ethic, which I call spirit aware.
I love it.
Which, it's like attending to the needs of the spirits, which is a lot of what we've been talking about, right? I can understand in some ways the desire to maintain it as sort of a neutral practice that multiple people can come to. But I think that as different communities pick it up, we're all kind of taking our own take on it. And I think in nature spirituality, certainly in Druidry and in the AODA, there's a lot of us in AODA, for example, that are using permaculture and thinking about it and reading about it as part of our studies. And I do really feel like part of the problem that we face today, besides, human sort of narcissistic behavior towards the land, is just also this idea that we we have a disenchanted landscape that we as you know, the last 4 centuries or whatever of extractive activities and, you know, and, you know, really like strongly materialistic and scientific rationalism and some of these practices have really kind of pulled the spirits and pulled the enchantment out of the world. And part of how we reconnect is through those spiritual means. And so to me, permaculture is an awesome outer practice, but without grounding in some kind of inner spiritual life. And I mean, inner life can mean a lot of things. And as a druid, I'm not dogmatic and I don't convert anybody to druidry. Like, you could do what you want. But I think in the end, we all need to have some kind of connection to the divine and to nature and to spirit, right? And what that might look like is like not really my business to tell anybody else, you know, because I think there's lots of paths to that, right? But losing that piece, I do really feel like I feel like we need it. And I'll give you a really cool story though. I mean, I have a lot of examples of times where we were doing permaculture and then like things happened. So when I lived in Michigan, this was like the first homestead I had. It was a 3-acre homestead and I was there for 6 years, and we actually started a permaculture meetup, and we would get like, we were in the Detroit metro area. We would get sometimes like 30 and 40 people to come. And I would host a couple of times a year, and we would be at the house or maybe at a fire pit. But like, if you just walked like a couple of minutes, like down past the pond, there was the stone circle where the druids met and we did our rituals. And it would always be interesting to me that people would find the stone circle and people like, oh, what's this? You know? So here these people are doing this physical practice of permaculture, and suddenly they find themselves in a spiritual place. And I'm like, oh, that's a stone circle. We have a druid grove here. Like, we meet for the seasonal celebrations. And they're like, oh, wow, like that sounds really cool. Or, you know, we're having a conversation about soil web and the soil web of life and the mycelial web. And suddenly, like, you realize how deeply spiritual just understanding those things are. And so even though, like, even in my permaculture design training and teacher training, when people found out I was a druid, there was a lot of really great conversation and openness about the intersection of nature, spirituality, and permaculture. So while I don't necessarily think those things are like mainstream, I feel like the more that I sort of interact with people and talk about it, the more that there becomes an interest in that. And I also think that, like, the longer that you get your hands in the soil, at some point you're going to start to really understand that there is a metaphysical side to this, that it is sacred. Your plants are almost talking to you, even if you can't quite hear them. You must know what they need or what they want. And I can't tell you how many conversations I've had over the years with people that, you know, oh yeah, like I really feel this, and they don't even have a language for it, but yet it's there. And so to me, sort of bringing in and merging that physical with the metaphysical, to me, is really powerful. And really, it's really sort of the core of some of the practices that I've been doing for a long time and really thinking about. And sort of, how do you find a way to be whole and sane and like okay in this destructive time, right? It's some of those tools I feel that have really helped.
Yeah. I want to go back even further, because you mentioned edge, and I've been waiting for a moment when it felt like the right time to ask it. So edge in permaculture is really important, and you are creating a piece of edge where you are right now. And I don't know how much other edge is available in your area, you know, because I do know, you know, the industry of Pennsylvania, and we do have some coal mining here too in Kentucky. We don't have a lot of other destructive, there's no fracking, thank goodness. But can you expand on edge and what the importance of edge is to the people that are listening?
Yeah. So the permaculture design technique or principle is like, use the edges and value the marginal, or something like that, right? I think that's actually Holmgren's. But so when we think about like the edges and margins, so you could think about looking at the edge of between a forest and a field. What you see is that's actually the place where there's the most diversity. That's where you're going to find a lot of the medicinal plants, like the idea of the hedgerow, right? And so thinking about edges and marginal spaces in permaculture is a really powerful concept, because those are spaces where we see a lot of connection, a lot of diversity. And yeah, I mean, I feel like our whole land in some ways is this edge space, because we're in this tiny little pocket where we've got all these like, like corn, mostly for around here, it's feed fields for, it's either corn or soybeans, or it's like corn to feed dairy cattle, because a lot of our local farms do a lot of dairy, or it's hay fields, so we've got these sort of really monocrops that are, and then we're this little pocket, right, of all this intense life, and thinking about the edge between that. When does that spill out, right? When does that edge stop being contained, right? But I also think about the edges and the margins in other ways. So we also sort of have this monoculture, right? That's sort of promoting certain sets of values and principles that are not good for the planet. And like, no amount of trying to fix it or throw technology at it is solving the problems. Like, they're getting worse every year. Like, I'm literally looking outside and there's so much smog I can't see. There's so much wildfire smoke I can't see the sky, right? Okay, like, obviously these things are not working. And so thinking about ourselves as nature-based spiritual practitioners, as permaculturists, as people that have a diversity of belief, that are inhabiting that edge space, and are connecting with other people that also have that diversity, that are in some ways, we're sort of standing on the edges of sort of maybe a brighter, better future with different values, and one was standing like with one foot in each, right? Because I still have to be in my local community. And I mean, I practice nature spirituality, but when I'm doing plant walks or teaching permaculture here to a rural conservative white audience, I'm probably not, I'm standing on that edge. I'm standing enough in their space that they're like, wow, oh, maybe I shouldn't spray my lawn because there's all these medicinal food plants and dandelions, and oh wow, right? But I'm also sort of also have a foot in the spirit world, right? And so thinking about that, not only in terms of ecosystems, but in terms of people, and then how can we leverage change? So, in my local community, I do a lot of plant walks and plant education and herbalism and things like that. And the way I see it is that somebody's going to be out there doing it. And if it's not me, maybe they're not teaching it in a way that is as ethical and is thinking about regeneration and future generations, and taking, like, how do we give more than we take, and so when I do these things, we always talk a lot about like, oh, well, what are the abundant plants? What are the plants that are, like, I don't like the term invasive, but what are the opportunistic plants, and how much of those should we be harvesting versus, say, a plant like milkweed, which is decreasing in the ecosystem? So then I give everybody a bag of milkweed seeds and tell them to go start their own milkweed patch before they harvest, and that's like a very marginal thing, right? And so I like that idea, because I feel like it sort of gives us an interesting space to inhabit, recognizing that sometimes I have to step fully into sort of this more dominant culture. And sometimes I can step fully into sort of more my spiritual permaculture druid self, but being able to stay on that marginal space in the same way that ecosystem, the divide between those two ecosystems are really rich. And the divide between, say, the edge of our land and our abundant ecosystem, which is slowly like sending those milkweed seeds out, for example, I think that's really productive. And I think that that's a positive framing of difficult circumstances that I like. And then, of course, it does sort of honor and celebrate lots of diverse voices and diverse perspectives, which we really need right now. So I think that sort of we can think about that both from the human world and the natural world and the spirit world all.
Yeah, it sounds to me like what you're saying is that people might grow faster, or at least you've alluded to this, or I'm interpreting it this way. You can tell me if you agree. If people could grow faster if they would adopt more edge in themselves. So, and they might open more if they adopted more edge.
Yeah, because being on the edges and being on the margins is about seeing multiple perspectives. It's about flexibility. It's about, I like to think about, like, the lessons of today are lessons of resiliency. Like, we think about the terms that matter: resiliency, regeneration, rewilding, and how do I cultivate that edge space within me and that marginal space within me so that I can be more resilient. What is resilience? Resilience is adaptation to change. I want to cultivate resilient ecosystems, but I also want to cultivate a resilient self. And
Right.
that is all about being able to walk across those boundaries and not be too firmly rooted in one place. Because if I'm too firmly rooted, I'm not resilient and adaptable. So, when we think about cultural resilience, we think about ecological resilience or personal resilience, I think that is part of that. So I like to think about individuals like raccoon, right? Or Japanese knotweed, or like these, or staghorn sumac, like plants and animals that really, a fox, right? That really have that deep resilience. And what can I learn from them about that resilience?
Yeah. Like what aspects do they have within themselves that makes them keep going? Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
So I was wondering, as a druid, I imagine that you conduct a lot of ritual on the land. You've already referred to ritual activities. And how does the energy of the land change when you are doing consistent ritual practices?
Yeah. So a lot of paganism, I think that there's like a real emphasis on the wheel of the year and the holy days and the high days. And I celebrate all of those, and I think those are great. But I think that as we're kind of getting deeper into some of the ecological challenges, a lot of people are starting to recognize that we need more intentional celebrations and ceremonies that really address the healing of the land, and maybe over time. So I'll give an example from something that AODA recently did. A year ago, we decided to transition all of our big high holy days, which would be the solstices and the equinoxes, into various aspects of land healing. So now, instead of just sort of going out and saying, it's a summer solstice, this is great, we as individuals all over the world are going out and doing a healing ceremony and sort of linking up with other people. And like, that's new, and it's really like kind of fun and radical. But I think that like the longer, so there's a couple of pieces to this. So one, the more people we can involve in doing whatever kind of healing that they can, the better, right? Because that is helping on that metaphysical level, and that's helping a problem that's bigger than all of us. But even individually, I have found, so I moved back to Pennsylvania, which is my home state. I moved back 8 years ago, and going to some of the same places over and over time, you can see a difference, and it can take years. I mean, there's work that I know will never be completed in my lifetime, but at least I'm doing something now. So I think like for us, like the difference between when we moved to the property that of course had been logged right before we bought it, and it was pretty damaged and had, probably like 10 burn pits, garbage everywhere. I mean, and these were people, and actually like these were typical Americans that actually liked their land and took care of it. But their idea of taking care of it was spraying pesticides. And so for us, it wasn't just about, it was about the physical cleaning up of the land first, and then all of that deep listening work. But then it was all of the ceremonies that we did over time. And again, working on both that outer and that inner level, working on both the physical and the metaphysical. So when you step on that land now, it's just like this like magical, whimsical place. There's spirits, trees say hello, the spirits talk to you. And we have a grove, so we have a lot of druids who come and visit and do ceremony with us there, and it's incredible to see the difference. And now, with these ceremonies in AODA, we're really trying to sort of do that on a larger scale. So really thinking about this idea of re-enchanting the world and bringing back some of that magic, and bringing back the idea that the world is full of life and spirit, and that, your milkweed patch or your dog, like these beings have spirits too. And like we can interact, and we can work with them in that way. And so it's, to me, been pretty tremendous to see how that change can happen and radiate out. At the same time, there are also really big challenges that, I think are too big for one person or a small group. We have, like in this area, we have these things called bony dumps, and they're basically giant piles of stuff that they dug out of the mines and then piled up. And most of these places are completely lifeless. We're talking like miles of these piles that are lifeless, and they're so hot and they're so toxic. And I look at those places and I'm like, I don't even know how much ceremony it would take to start shifting this. Is that, what do I do here? Maybe I plant a standing stone there and let the solar energy come down and radiate into the earth and let that sit there for 50 years, because that's all I can do, right? So I think it's sort of like looking at the situation, where can I do the most good? Where am I being called? And what kind of work? Is it physical regeneration? Is it scattering milkweed seeds? Is it putting, is it, helping regenerate a forest? Or is it more actually like, this bony dump is way too big for me physically to do, so I'm going to set a standing stone for it, because, we druids, we love stone circles. I'm going to set a standing stone, and I'm going to pull that beautiful solar energy into that land. And over time, hopefully that will help. And I'll maybe go back there once a year and do ceremony. So it's sort of, I really think it depends on where you are and what you're doing, how big of a group you have. We've done some big, large scale land healing celebrations at some of our druid events, for example, which are also really cool. So there's a lot of different people doing a lot of different things out there. And again, that diversity, right, is a good thing.
Yeah, definitely. I do a lot of that energetic, like activation of things as well, so that I work with the land that way, because it's so big that there's no other way to do it. So I'm so glad to know that there's somebody like you out there doing so much. I'm wondering, one of the things that jumped out at me was just the title of your book, Sacred Actions. Would you expand on what this book is about? And I'm actually wondering if there are rituals in here that maybe one or just a small group of people can do. I'm just curious. Just because I think that if we could get more people, even if it's just one person doing it, it could make a huge difference.
Yeah. Well, I'll step back and say, in terms of me doing so much, I think that these are always community efforts. And I think that all of us are doing things like, what we're doing in AODA, since I'm the head of AODA, I've been able to sort of bring some of my own land healing agenda in. And a lot of the people in AODA were like, yeah, we really feel this is good. And so there's sort of I think the more that we can bring people together and think about like either larger group rituals or even distributed rituals, joining these online rituals, joining full moon meditation, like Obad does full moon meditations for peace, there's a lot of power when even if you were not physically present, there's a lot of power in getting together, even if it's like everybody doing it in their own place. And so I do feel like that's part of how we, I think that's a part of how we address the too big problem. So the book Sacred Actions, that was released in 2021. And that book is focused on the synthesis of everyday action and nature spirituality, and it uses a lot of permaculture and sustainable living. So the goal of that book, when I say sacred action, it's the idea of, it really comes back to the conundrum I talked about, a little bit already, which is, you have this beautiful nature spirituality practice. It's rich, it's vibrant, you're celebrating the seasons, and yet it's really hard to align daily life with that, right? Especially in this culture, like these are not easy things to do. American culture is all about throwaway things, consuming, trying to move as fast as you possibly can. Like, I mean, when you look at what this culture teaches us and the ways that we are some ways forced to live because of building codes and all these things, like, so what I was trying to do with this concept was say, okay, let us think about small solutions. Let us think about everyday practice, and how do we live that in a sacred way that honors the earth? So how do we take, and how do we do that in, and so the book is like literally chock full of things like converting your lawn into a garden and vermicomposting and, creating the home as a sacred space and, looking into passive solar, all these crazy things, right? But they're all done in the course of, this is sacred activity. This isn't separating the physical and the metaphysical. These are bringing these things together. So there are rituals in that book that are often tied to sort of that ongoing journey. I would say that my forthcoming book, if we're thinking about a lot of land healing, the forthcoming book is chock full of land healing practices using some of the frameworks I talked about, like when would we actively, energetically heal? When would we physically regenerate? What are rituals to support that? Refugio work is in there. When do we do palliative care? What do we do when things die around us, or a species in our area or our region goes extinct? How do we deal with that? Some of it's really hard work. So my forthcoming book has much more of those ritual practices. But I would say the other thing is, for people who are interested in nature spirituality, AODA is very committed to these sort of distributed group rituals, and we're doing them and really actively supporting them in our community. So that might, if that might be of interest, we are a nonprofit organization in the US. So that might be something else to check out if you're interested in sort of how would I connect with others to do sort of larger scale land healing. So those would be like the two resources. And I have like lots of stuff on my blog as well.
That's good. That's good for those of us who, I personally am a rebuilding community. So, because I've only been here 2 years. So that's good information for me to have, where I can look into it. I can find some things to join. And even though we are, a long drive apart, online communities are awesome. I do want to go back and get your definition of permaculture, just to wrap that up for everybody. I know everybody's they've been hearing it this whole time and have maybe an idea of what it is, but everybody seems to have a different definition of what is permaculture. And based on what I've heard from you, I think you already are not going to let anybody go away confused that it's just about how you grow food.
No.
So please give us your definition.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, there's, when we hear the textbook definitions, it's like, it's a design system working with nature rather than against nature. And I don't really see it. I mean, it is that, right? But to me, I see it as I see permaculture as a very powerful human tool that can be used to regenerate and heal our ecosystems, and through that ourselves, and regenerate our land, our connections, the connections between humans and nature, and using and having an ethical system that we can apply, having these principles that we can apply, but also, some of my own personal additions, like the spirit aware, right? Those sorts of things. To me, it's all about taking us from a place of of consuming and harming to a place of healing and regeneration, and offering people a set of very powerful tools and practices and systems of thinking to do that. And I don't think, like, before I discovered permaculture, before I did in like doing my PDC, those were some of the most empowering experiences of my entire life, because what permaculture did for me is that it shifted my paradigm about myself. It shifted this idea that, wow, okay, in some ways, like Ben Falk talks about this at the beginning of this film called Inhabit. So Inhabit actually came out of the PDC that I did. It was one of the other people who did the PDC. I did a permaculture design certificate through Sowing Solutions up in Massachusetts. And we were at an eco village, which was super cool. They've done it a little differently recently, but and this guy went around and interviewed all these people in different places about permaculture. It's a really great resource. And at the beginning, Ben Falk, who's a pretty well-known permaculturist, said, if we take sort of what society says, then it's all about doing less bad. But ultimately, like, if you follow all these sort of like traditional environmental things, it's almost like you shouldn't exist. You're better off not existing. You're better off not being here, because you are a damage to this planet. And it's a really destructive way of looking at it, right? But that's a lot of the messaging. I mean, you see that a lot in like ecosystem conservation. The idea is you are not to be in that forest. You are not there because all you know how to do is cause damage. And what permaculture to me does is it takes this whole idea and it flips it on its head. And no, actually, and if we look at, say, indigenous societies and how they lived, and a great resource for this, I mean, Braiding Sweetgrass, Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, but
my favorite.
The other book that really talks about this, that has really empowered me, is Tyson Yunkaporta's Sand Talk. So
that's one I don't know.
Oh, Sand Talk is so fabulous. And he talks about because he's drawing a lot from Aboriginal, and he's an Aboriginal Australian, who, of course, we will mention, they had a 60,000 year continuous culture. So they're doing some things right. Yeah. So in his book, one of the things that he breaks down is that the Aboriginals understood that the original goal at every being on the planet had a role, and humanity's role was being caretakers and guardians of the land. Right. And we see that reflected in many, many indigenous cultures throughout the world. Yeah. And I think that permaculture gives people like me, right? Like a white person living in this colonized situation, coming out of this culture, it gives me tools to begin to think about that relationship, that I am shifting from this exploitive relationship that my culture has given me and into a relationship of care and respect and love, right? And reciprocation. And this idea that I'm not better than this ecosystem, that I am equal to that tree and that ant and those plants, and we all have a right to life, and that I am a person that is capable of doing good. And the more that I study this and study my local ecosystem, and the more that I pray to those spirits, the more that I'm learning how to do that and retaking and reclaiming that role, which will save the planet. That is ultimately the way I see it. So it's a tool, right? It's a great tool, but that's what I think it really is. Now, that's not what's in the permaculture books. That's not what they're teaching in PDCs, but that's my understanding of after doing it for that long and practicing it as a druid.
That was really inspiring to me. I love that book too, Braiding Sweetgrass. It really spoke to me very deeply about cooperation with the land and deep listening, and how you can be a scientist and still be a spiritual person who can see the magic. I'm really glad that you brought that up. And that isn't the first time it's been brought up during this summit. That's a great book. If you're listening and you haven't read it, it's the best read. It's just amazing. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you would like to say?
I mean, I think there's another piece I haven't talked about that I'd like to talk about.
Hey.
And I think this comes out of, sort of some of the things that are happening now, and some of the sort of, one of the things that I'm concerned about, being in a leadership role in the Druid community, and, thinking about the conversations we have in AODA, a lot of people that are new. We've seen a great deal of people like AODA, like we've doubled in size in 3 years, because so many people, like during the pandemic and that big shift, so many people are starting to find nature spirituality. And I think the more that we're sort of seeing some of these like terrible things happening on our land, the more people are looking for that. But one of the things that we've noticed that's happening, especially as as the smoke clouds the sky, and as we're seeing these wildfires, is a lot of despair and a lot of anxiety, and a lot of like people don't know what to do. And I mean, I suffer from this too. Like, I'm not saying I have it all figured out, but one of the things that's really helped me is really thinking about how to come to even these more difficult places of damaged lands, you damaged people, like the damage and the trauma that is embodied both within us and on our land. How do we transform that into joy and into hope? And to work through, think about like working through our grief, working through our sadness, but eventually like doing that work so that we can come to the land, we can come to the permaculture practices, the inner and outer practices of healing, with hope and with joy in our hearts, because sometimes that's like almost the most powerful thing. And it's a lesson I've really had to learn hard here, because I go out on my landscape here and it's really like sometimes very dystopian. Like we have these beautiful forests and then we have all this terrible fracking, right? And I'm like, and if I go to that site and I'm like pissed off and I'm having a moment and I'm angry, like that's what I'm projecting. But if I go there and I, say, bring my friend St. John's wort or dandelion with me and bring the joy and bring the light and bring the hope, to me, that's really a lot of the power. And that's of course, the lesson of nature. Nature immediately begins regenerating after trauma. And maybe the traumas that nature have faced will forever change the living earth, but nature will prevail. And we have to remember that too. So I really feel like a lot of this, it's not just about me physically going and doing things or me going rituals, but it's also about me cultivating within myself the hope for a better future, knowing that we have the tools. We have so many new people who are coming into some of these traditions and finding their way and saying, wow, like I don't really like what's going on here, and I want to find a better path, and I want to learn how to be reconnected with nature, because that's ultimately what is going to change the course of human civilization, is shifting that. But to me, that has to be rooted in joy and hope. There's a book Joanna Macy wrote called Coming Back to Life, and it has a lot of really great techniques for like dealing with some of that, like dealing with our own human emotions about that, so that we can then go out and be good tenders, good healers of the land. So that's another resource I recommend, to sort of say, how do we come with joy, which can be difficult.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm really glad you're here on the planet right now, Dana. You're much needed and very much appreciated. And I know that you have some ideas, free gifts that listeners may get to enjoy. Why don't you share what you're thinking about?
Yeah. So what I already shared, we'll be sharing some resources for ethical interaction with the land. So I have some from wild food foraging, like if you teach wild food foraging or you're practicing it, I developed essentially an ethical system for that. So I have some handouts for that. And based on this conversation, I'll also put together some resources for land healing for people. Yeah.
Excellent. I can't wait to see what they are. And how can everybody get in contact with you or follow your wisdom and content?
Sure. If you go to thedruidsgarden.com, that's my website. So I have a weekly blog. I've been blogging there for like 13 or 14 years on these topics. So I have the blog. I have a newsletter there, books, and then I also do a lot of art, which we didn't talk about art and sacred art
I
at all.
know
I'm a druid, so the
so
druid
beautiful.
tradition, the Druid tradition has three major divisions, and that's Ovate, which is a lot of what we talked about today, was the Ovate, the land connection, and Druid, which is the ceremony. But Druids also are Bardic practitioners, which are the creative arts. So if you're interested in following some of my artwork, I have an Instagram. It's at Druids Garden Art, and I can obviously give you those.
And that's how I found you, because
Yeah.
I'm an artist. I don't post it all over like you do. I'm not as prolific as you are, but I love your artwork. So I highly recommend you, if you just want to feel better, go look at some of Dana's art.
Yeah, one of the things I've been really experimenting with lately is sort of how do we combine all those things. So how are we doing like land healing art, and really thinking and bringing that joy and creating a better vision for the future. And I think artists and musicians and poets, dreamers, right? Like people like bringing that into the world. And we don't want all these dystopian visions people are giving us. Like, let's create a different one, let's bring that joy in. And so
Right.
some of that, I feel like that's part of my artistic practice too.
Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you so much for participating. And I would love to spotlight you again sometime when I start my podcast. So
Sounds great.
we can talk about art during, we can share art. So thank you so much for being here, Dana. I really appreciate you spending some time during your workday with us.
And thank you so much for the invitation. And thank you so much for putting on the summit. Like, I'm so excited to see that you're putting this together, and I can't wait to see what other people are saying and how the community responds. So thank you so much.
Everybody's wonderful. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to say goodbye for now, but we'll be back.